Behind Britain's gilded thrones lived monarchs whose behaviour shocked even their permissive eras. Tonight, we explore 40 royals whose vulgarity, excess, and scandalous conduct revealed the dark side of unchecked privilege. From kings who paraded mistresses through palace halls to those whose cruelty became entertainment, these stories uncover how royals who could do anything often did everything society deemed unacceptable. Their conduct wasn't merely improper, it was deliberately, shockingly vulgar in ways that redefined the boundaries of royal behaviour. Before we begin this journey through royal scandal, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Dim the lights, settle in, and let the pace slow. Feel free to leave a comment letting us know where you're listening from. Now, let's begin. Number 1. King Henry VIII. Divine right to indulge. How does a king transform personal desire into divine mandate? King Henry VIII, who ruled England from 1509 to 1547, elevated vulgarity to state policy. His serial marriages and public executions of wives demonstrating how completely he believed his appetites justified any action. Born in 1491 as the spare who became heir, Henry didn't merely indulge in shocking behaviours. He insisted that what would be sin for others became righteousness when performed by divinely appointed royalty. Contemporary observers documented Henry's transformation from athletic young king to bloated tyrant whose vulgar appetites consumed everything around him. His treatment of his wives combined public spectacle with private cruelty in ways that shocked even courtiers accustomed to royal prerogative. When he tired of Catherine of Aragon after decades of marriage, he subjected her to years of public humiliation, while insisting his desire for Anne Boleyn was actually God's will becoming clear to him. Historical sources record how Henry required his court to participate in this fiction, making personal lust into a theological crisis that split England from Rome. His execution of Anne Boleyn on fabricated charges of adultery demonstrated the depths of his vulgar ruthlessness. He had broken his kingdom's religion to marry her, then casually discarded her life when she failed to produce a male heir, and his attention turned elsewhere. The Crown insisted this was justice rather than murder driven by royal convenience. Catherine Howard's execution followed similar patterns. A young woman granted briefly to the king's attention before being destroyed when his interest waned, her death treated as righteousness rather than elimination of someone who had ceased to please him. The vulgarity wasn't merely in his actions, but in his complete lack of shame about them. Henry ate to grotesque excess, his body swelling until he required mechanical assistance to move. Yet he maintained the fiction of his own magnificence, even as his physical deterioration became impossible to ignore. He died in 1547, at age 55, having transformed English society to accommodate his desires. Number 2. King Charles II, the Merry Monarch's shameless court. What happens when a king decides shame is for lesser men? King Charles II, who ruled England from 1660 to 1685 after years of exile, returned to his throne determined that restraint and propriety had died with the Puritan Commonwealth. Born in 1630, Charles transformed the English court from Cromwell's severe simplicity into a pleasure palace where his mistresses wielded power, his illegitimate children received noble titles, and excess became celebrated as the natural expression of restored monarchy. The sheer openness of Charles's vulgar conduct was what made it so shocking. He didn't maintain mistresses discreetly as previous kings had done. He paraded them through court, gave them positions of influence, and expected courtiers to treat these women with the respect due to royalty, despite everyone knowing they were there purely for the king's sexual pleasure. Barbara Villiers held such sway that foreign ambassadors courted her favour as if she were the queen, while Charles's actual wife, Catherine of Braganza, was forced to witness this public humiliation daily as part of her royal duties. Historical records document at least 12 illegitimate children Charles openly acknowledged and supported financially, several of whom he elevated to the peerage with dukedoms and substantial estates. This wasn't merely having affairs, it was creating an entire shadow aristocracy built on royal bastards, each one a walking testament to the king's sexual appetites and his complete disregard for propriety. The titles he granted included Duke of Monmouth, Duke of Richmond, Duke of Grafton, positions of genuine power handed to products of what would have been scandalous conduct for anyone else, but became normalised through royal approval. Court life under Charles became synonymous with decadence. Gambling ran rampant, drinking to excess was expected, and sexual intrigue dominated every interaction. The king himself set the tone, his witticisms often vulgar, his behaviour unrestrained. He died in 1685 at age 54, reportedly apologising on his deathbed for being an unconscionable time dying, a final quip that captured his lifetime of making shamelessness into art. Number 3. King George IV. Drunken extravagance and public cruelty. Can a prince spend decades preparing to be king while perfecting only vulgarity? King George IV, who ruled from 1820 to 1830 after serving as Prince Regent from 1811, elevated self-indulgence to new heights while treating his wife with such public cruelty that even his own supporters found his conduct difficult to defend. Born in 1762 as the eldest son of George III, he spent his entire adult life demonstrating that being born to rule guaranteed neither dignity nor decency. His treatment of Caroline of Brunswick, whom he was forced to marry in 1795 to settle his enormous debts, represented vulgarity, a sustained campaign of public humiliation. George was reportedly drunk at their wedding and spent the wedding night passed out in the fireplace. From that point forward, he made no secret of his contempt for his wife, maintaining mistresses openly while attempting to deny Caroline access to their daughter and later working to prevent her from being crowned queen. His attempt to divorce her through a public trial became a spectacle that humiliated the monarchy itself. Contemporary accounts describe George's physical excess as grotesque. His waist eventually measured over 50 inches, his weight requiring specially constructed furniture and carriages. He drank to notorious excess, often appearing in public clearly intoxicated at events where royal dignity should have prevailed. His spending was equally vulgar. He ran up debts that required repeated parliamentary intervention, pouring money into building projects and personal luxuries while showing no concern for the financial burden his appetites placed on the nation. The vulgarity of his personal life extended to how he conducted his kingship. He was petty, vindictive toward those who displeased him, and more concerned with his own comfort than with governing. When Caroline died in 1821, he prevented her body from lying in state and rushed to ensure she wouldn't be buried in Westminster Abbey, his cruelty extending even beyond her death. He died in 1830 at age 67, having demonstrated that a throne cannot bestow dignity on someone determined to be vulgar. Number 4. Edward VII, the prince who made vice fashionable. What happens when the heir to the throne spends 60 years making scandal his hobby? Edward VII, who finally became king in 1901 after the longest apprenticeship in British history, spent his entire adult life as Prince of Wales, treating London's brothels and Paris's courtesans as extensions of his personal court. Born in 1841 as Victoria's eldest son, Edward transformed royal impropriety from occasional transgression into lifestyle. His behaviour so consistently vulgar that it became expected rather than shocking. The sheer scale of his affairs was staggering. Historical sources document relationships with actresses, aristocrats, married women, and professional courtesans across Europe. He didn't hide these liaisons, but conducted them with barely concealed openness, expecting society to politely ignore what everyone knew. The Mordaunt divorce case in 1870 publicly exposed his involvement with a married woman, requiring Edward to testify in court, an unprecedented humiliation for royalty that he endured because his conduct had become impossible to deny. His visits to Parisian brothels became so routine that establishments catered specifically to his preferences. Le Chabanais, one of Paris's most exclusive houses, maintained a special room for the Prince of Wales, complete with custom furniture designed to accommodate his considerable bulk during sexual encounters. This wasn't youthful indiscretion, but sustained pattern, continuing well into middle age. The future king, treating prostitution as a natural component of continental travel. What made Edward's vulgarity particularly notable was how it normalized excess for an entire social class. Where Victoria had insisted on moral propriety, Edward's set embraced adultery, gambling, and self-indulgence as marks of sophistication. Married women in his circle understood that resisting the prince's advances might mean social exclusion, creating an environment where sexual coercion hid behind the fiction of mutual desire. His friends and associates adopted similar patterns, creating what became known as the Marlborough House set, aristocrats for whom vulgar behaviour was the price of royal favour. Even after becoming king at age 59, Edward continued his affairs, though advancing age and worsening health limited his options. He maintained relationship with Alice Keppel that was acknowledged even by his wife, Queen Alexandra, who allowed Keppel to visit Edward on his deathbed. He died in 1910 at age 68, having demonstrated that decades of vulgar conduct created no barrier to eventually wearing the crown, though it certainly diminished its dignity. Number 5. James II. Authoritarian appetite and court indecency. Can religious devotion coexist with personal vulgarity? James II, who ruled from 1685 to 1688 before being deposed in the Glorious Revolution, combined Catholic fervour with sexual excess in ways that made even his brother Charles's court seem restrained. Born in 1633, James spent his life demonstrating that piety in public worship could mask considerable indecency in private behaviour. His first marriage to Anne Hyde created scandal before it occurred. James had gotten Anne pregnant while she served as maid of honour to his sister, and historical accounts suggest he considered abandoning her despite his responsibility. When political considerations forced him to marry her in 1660, he did so resentfully, though he proceeded to father 8 children with her before she died in 1671. His treatment of Anne combined using her sexually with publicly diminishing her, his courtiers noting how he seemed to regard his wife as beneath his station, despite having compromised her himself. After Anne's death, James's behaviour worsened. He took mistresses openly, most notably Catherine Sedley, whom contemporaries described as neither beautiful nor particularly charming. Historical sources record James's own reported explanation that his confessor must have assigned her to him as penance, a vulgar joke that acknowledged the incompatibility while continuing the relationship. He made Sedley Countess of Dorchester, giving his mistress a title while maintaining the fiction of Catholic devotion that supposedly governed his life. His second marriage to Mary of Modena in 1673 created its own scandal. Mary was only 15 to James's 40, and the age difference combined with his history made the match seem predatory, even by contemporary standards. James's insistence on Catholic ceremony despite being heir to a Protestant throne showed how completely he prioritized his desires over political wisdom or propriety. What made James's vulgarity particularly offensive was the hypocrisy. He insisted on rigorous Catholic observance in public while maintaining private conduct that violated the Church's teachings he claimed to uphold. He demanded his subjects tolerate his faith while showing no restraint in his own appetites. His attempt to force Catholic officials into government positions combined this personal hypocrisy with political authoritarianism that alienated even potential supporters. His deposition in 1688 came partly because his vulgarity had destroyed any reservoir of goodwill. When William of Orange invaded, James's support collapsed because few felt loyalty to a king who combined religious coercion with personal indecency. He died in exile in 1701 at age 67, having demonstrated that vulgar conduct undermines authority, regardless of claims to divine right. Number 6. William Rufus, the Red King's scandalous court. What did it mean when medieval chroniclers called a king's behaviour unnatural? William Rufus, who ruled England from 1087 to 1100, earned contemporary accusations of shocking immorality that writers barely felt comfortable describing directly. Born around 1060 as the third son of William the Conqueror, William Rufus created a court atmosphere so vulgar that religious chroniclers suggested divine punishment when he died in a hunting accident that many suspected was assassination. Contemporary sources describe William's court as dominated by young men wearing elaborate clothing and exhibiting behaviour that writers termed shameful and against nature. The historical record suggests relationships and conduct that violated medieval norms so completely that chroniclers struggled to document them explicitly. Whether these accusations reflected genuine behaviour or merely contemporary hostility to an unpopular king remains debated, but the sheer volume and consistency of complaints suggests something about William's court genuinely shocked his contemporaries. His treatment of the church demonstrated vulgar disregard for religious authority. When Archbishop Lanfranc died in 1089, William left the position vacant for 4 years, appropriating church revenues for himself. He openly mocked religious figures and treated ecclesiastical property as his personal treasury, showing contempt for institutions his society considered sacred. His famous response to Archbishop Anselm's objections, reportedly crude and insulting, demonstrated how completely he rejected propriety when it conflicted with his desires. Historical accounts describe William's physical appearance and behaviour in terms suggesting contemporaries found both vulgar. His reddish complexion gave him his nickname Rufus, but sources also note his stocky build, his preference for elaborate dress, and his manner of speaking that was considered crude. He never married despite pressure to produce heirs, fueling speculation about his private life that chroniclers recorded in deliberately vague but clearly disapproving language. His death in 1100 during a hunting expedition in the New Forest became immediate subject of rumour. The official account, that he was accidentally shot by Walter Tyrrell, satisfied few observers who noted how quickly his brother Henry seized the throne afterward. Whether accident, murder, or even suicide, William's end seemed fitting to chroniclers who had condemned his reign's vulgarity. They interpreted his death as divine judgment, suggesting that even God couldn't tolerate his conduct indefinitely. The historical record leaves William Rufus as a figure whose exact transgressions remain partially obscured by the limitations of medieval documentation, but whose vulgarity was clear enough that writers risked their own reputations to condemn it. Number 7. King John, cruelty as entertainment. How does a king transform humiliation into court spectacle? King John, who ruled England from 1199 to 1216, combined sexual coercion with public cruelty in ways that made him legendary for vulgarity, even in an age that accepted considerable royal violence. Born in 1166 as the youngest son of Henry II, John demonstrated throughout his reign that lack of restraint in personal appetites inevitably extended to governance. Historical sources document John's pattern of sexual predation toward the wives and daughters of his nobles. This wasn't merely having affairs, but systematic targeting of women whose families were politically vulnerable, using royal authority to coerce compliance while knowing victims had little recourse. The specific accusations varied, but the pattern was consistent. John treated women under his authority as available for his pleasure, their consent irrelevant when opposed to his desires. His treatment of hostages showed particular vulgarity. When he held prisoners, John didn't merely confine them, but reportedly found entertainment in their suffering. Contemporary chroniclers record accusations that he personally participated in torturing captives, finding amusement in their pain. Whether these specific accounts were accurate or propaganda from his enemies, they reflect that his contemporaries believed him capable of such conduct, a reputation that itself indicates how completely his actual behaviour had destroyed any presumption of royal dignity. The vulgar cruelty extended to how he governed. When nobles displeased him, John's revenge often targeted their families rather than confronting them directly. He would seize estates, imprison relatives, or use legal mechanisms to destroy those who opposed him. This vindictiveness combined personal malice with abuse of royal power in ways that made governing class fear not just political consequences, but personal destruction. His treatment of William de Braos and his family exemplified this cruel vulgarity. When de Braos fell from favour, John pursued his entire family with vicious determination. Historical sources suggest John deliberately starved de Braos's wife and eldest son to death while imprisoned, a fate that shocked even contemporaries accustomed to harsh punishment. Whether the specific details are accurate, the reputation shows how John's conduct exceeded what his age considered acceptable royal severity. What made John's vulgarity particularly damaging was its capricious quality. No one was safe because loyalty provided no protection against his changing moods. This created paranoia throughout his court and nobility, everyone wondering when they might become targets of royal cruelty. The Barons' Revolt leading to Magna Carta in 1215 reflected accumulated rage at King, whose conduct had destroyed any possibility of trust or respect. He died in 1216 at age 49, having demonstrated that vulgar abuse of power eventually provokes resistance that mere authority cannot suppress. Number 8. Henry II. Rage and Family. Humiliation. What happens when a powerful king cannot control his temper? Henry II, who ruled England from 1154 to 1189, combined political brilliance with personal vulgarity that manifested in explosive rage and public humiliation of those closest to him. Born in 1133, Henry built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but demonstrated repeatedly that power over territories didn't translate to control over his own conduct. His affairs were numerous and barely concealed, but his treatment of his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine showed particular vulgar disregard. Eleanor was herself a powerful figure, bringing the Duchy of Aquitaine to their marriage and having previously been Queen of France, yet Henry conducted relationships with other women so openly that Eleanor's humiliation became court spectacle. His affair with Rosamond Clifford was especially notorious, historical sources suggesting he maintained her in a residence specifically for his access, making no effort to hide the relationship from his wife or court. The vulgarity of his rage became legendary. Contemporary accounts describe Henry's fury as terrifying and uncontrolled. He would throw himself on the floor, tear his clothes, literally roll in the dirt when sufficiently angry. These weren't calculated displays, but genuine loss of control that made even his supporters fear his presence during episodes. The behaviour was considered beneath a king's dignity, yet Henry seemed incapable of maintaining restraint when his will was crossed. His treatment of Thomas Becket combined this rage with consequences that haunted him for life. When Becket, whom Henry had elevated to Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting a compliant ally, instead defended church authority against royal power, Henry's frustration built over years. His famous outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" whether actually spoken or later invention, captured how his ungoverned anger created conditions for murder. 4 knights interpreted his rage as instruction, killing Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170. Henry's public penance afterward showed he understood how completely his vulgar lack of control had destroyed his reputation, though the performance couldn't undo the consequences. His relationship with his sons demonstrated an ongoing pattern of using humiliation as control method. Henry promised them territories and authority, but refused to grant actual power, keeping his adult sons in subordinate positions while expecting their gratitude. When they rebelled, he turned vicious, pursuing them with personal vindictiveness that went beyond necessary military response. His treatment of his captured son Geoffrey showed this. Historical sources suggest he kept Geoffrey imprisoned in conditions designed to humiliate rather than merely confine. The vulgar irony of his final years was complete. His sons Richard and John allied with Philip of France against him, and Henry's defeats forced him to accept humiliating terms. When he saw John's name among the rebels, historical accounts describe his complete emotional collapse. He died in 1189 at age 56, reportedly saying, "Shame. Shame on a conquered king," his final words acknowledging how his own conduct had destroyed the family loyalty he'd never bothered to earn. Number 9. Charles I. Righteous hypocrisy and court arrogance. Can moral rigidity become its own form of vulgarity? Charles I, who ruled from 1625 until his execution in 1649, combined public insistence on propriety with private conduct that revealed the hypocrisy beneath his pious facade. Born in 1600, Charles spent his reign demanding standards from others that his own behaviour contradicted, his arrogance so complete that he seemed genuinely unable to recognise his own vulgarity. His early court cultivated an atmosphere of moral superiority that masked considerable indecency. Charles insisted on elaborate ceremony and rigid etiquette, presenting himself as defender of proper conduct against Puritan excess. Yet behind this facade, his court favourites received advancement through personal charm rather than merit, and his relationships with men like George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, inherited from his father James, showed the same pattern of inappropriate intimacy that had marked the previous reign. The difference was Charles's insistence that his behaviour was righteous, while others' similar conduct was scandalous. His treatment of Parliament demonstrated vulgar contempt for constitutional limits. When MPS questioned his policies or his favourites, Charles treated this as personal insult rather than legitimate concern. He arrested members of Parliament, dissolved sessions when they displeased him, and attempted to rule without Parliament entirely for 11 years. This wasn't merely authoritarian, it was personal vindictiveness dressed as royal prerogative, his inability to tolerate disagreement making governance impossible. The vulgarity of his religious policy combined genuine conviction with cruel enforcement. Charles and his Archbishop, William Laud, imposed Anglican uniformity with zealous determination, persecuting Puritans they considered too extreme while treating Scottish Presbyterians as rebels for rejecting English religious authority. The punishments inflicted on dissenters, branding, ear-cropping, imprisonment, were conducted in Charles's name as if brutality became righteous when defending his version of proper worship. His conduct during the Civil War showed how completely his arrogance had destroyed his political judgment. Even when defeated and negotiating from weakness, Charles couldn't bring himself to make genuine concessions. He negotiated in bad faith, made promises he intended to break, and treated his opponents with open contempt. Historical sources document how he believed that his royal dignity meant he couldn't truly be held accountable, that restoration would eventually come because his position was ordained by God regardless of his actions. His trial and execution in 1649 became theatre of mutual recrimination. Charles refused to recognise the court's authority, maintaining his dignity through silence that was actually stubborn refusal to engage with reality. His famous final words, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown," captured his complete conviction that his conduct had been righteous and his opponents were rebels against divine order. He died at age 48, having demonstrated that vulgarity masked as righteousness is perhaps the most dangerous form, impossible to reform because it cannot recognise itself. Number 10. George III. Madness and the loss of all restraint. What happens when illness strips away the thin veneer of royal dignity? George III, who ruled from 1760 until his death in 1820, though his son served as regent from 1811, spent his early reign as model of propriety before his mental illness revealed behaviours so vulgar that courtiers struggled to manage them. Born in 1738, George showed how even the most carefully maintained dignity could collapse into conduct that shocked those who witnessed it. His early years established a reputation for moral rectitude. Unlike his grandfather and great-grandfather, George was faithful to his wife, devoted to his children, and insisted on proper conduct at court. He presented himself as corrective to Hanoverian excess, a British king who valued virtue over vice. This made his later deterioration all the more shocking. The contrast between what he had been and what illness made him become highlighted the vulgarity of his decline. The first serious episode of his mental illness in 1788 revealed behaviours that courtiers found deeply disturbing. Historical accounts describe George speaking continuously without pause, his language becoming progressively more vulgar and inappropriate. He made sexual remarks to ladies of the court that violated every standard of proper conduct, his illness stripping away the restraint that had characterized his earlier behavior. Attendants recorded him using crude language, making advances toward female staff, and generally behaving in ways that would have been unthinkable during his periods of sanity. His physical behavior during episodes was equally disturbing. Sources document him appearing partially dressed before courtiers, his usual careful attention to royal appearance completely abandoned. He would wander the palace at night, sometimes without proper clothing, his attendants struggling to maintain some semblance of dignity while managing a king whose illness prevented him from caring about propriety. The contrast between his usual formality and this vulgar abandon made each episode more shocking. What made George's situation particularly tragic was his awareness during lucid periods. Historical records show he understood what had happened during his episodes and felt genuine shame about his conduct. He would apologize to those he'd offended, express horror at his own behavior, and try to restore his reputation for proper conduct. This cycle, vulgar behavior during illness, mortified recognition during recovery, continued for years before his final descent into permanent madness around 1810. His treatment by doctors added another layer of vulgarity to his situation. The cures inflicted on him included being restrained in a straitjacket for hours, subjected to blistering and purging, and generally treated with methods that amounted to torture. While attendants thought they were helping, they were actually adding physical abuse to his mental suffering. The king's body becoming site of medical violence that his position couldn't protect him from. His final decade was spent in complete seclusion at Windsor Castle, blind, deaf, and mad, occasionally playing the harpsichord or talking to people long dead. He died in 1820 at age 81, having spent the last years of his life in a state his earlier self would have found horrifying, his illness transforming a proper king into someone whose behaviour violated everything he'd once valued. Number 11. Edward VIII. Defiance as performance. How does a king make abdication itself seem vulgar? Edward VIII, who ruled for less than a year in 1936 before abdicating to marry Wallis Simpson, transformed constitutional crisis into personal drama with such self-absorption that even his supporters found his conduct difficult to defend. Born in 1894, Edward spent his life demonstrating that being born to rule meant nothing if you lacked any sense of duty beyond personal gratification. His behaviour as Prince of Wales established patterns that made his abdication unsurprising to those who'd observed him closely. Edward conducted numerous affairs with married women, showing particular preference for those already in relationships, as if their unavailability made them more attractive. His relationship with Freda Dudley Ward lasted 16 years before he abruptly ended it upon meeting Wallis Simpson, demonstrating the casual cruelty with which he discarded people once they ceased to interest him. His pursuit of Wallis Simpson crossed into vulgarity through its complete disregard for propriety or consequence. Simpson was married to her second husband when Edward became infatuated with her, yet he made no effort to hide the relationship. He brought her to court functions, introduced her to his family, and generally behaved as if his position allowed him to violate social norms without consequence. When her second divorce became necessary for them to marry, Edward involved himself directly in speeding the process, using his influence to manipulate the legal system for personal benefit. The abdication crisis itself revealed the depths of his vulgar self-centeredness. Presented with the choice between the woman he loved and his constitutional duty, Edward framed this as romantic sacrifice rather than abandonment of responsibility. His abdication speech presented himself as victim forced to choose between incompatible goods, ignoring that his situation resulted entirely from his own choices. He made himself the hero of a love story when he was actually someone who'd placed personal desire above the duty he'd been prepared from birth to assume. His conduct after abdication descended into increasing vulgarity. His visit to Nazi Germany in 1937, meeting with Hitler and seemingly sympathetic to fascist ideology, suggested shocking political judgment at best and potential disloyalty at worst. Historical sources indicate he provided information to German contacts during World War II that could have compromised British security, his resentment at his treatment apparently overriding any sense of national loyalty. His decades of exile with Wallace became extended performance of aggrieved victimhood. Edward insisted on royal treatment while no longer being royal, demanded recognition for Wallace that she'd never receive, and generally behaved as if the world owed him deference despite his having voluntarily surrendered his position. His constant complaints about money, status, and respect revealed someone whose vulgarity lay in his complete inability to accept consequences of his own actions. He died in 1972 at age 77, having spent most of his adult life demonstrating that being born to privilege didn't guarantee any understanding of duty, restraint, or appropriate conduct. His vulgarity wasn't in sexual excess or physical indulgence, but in the spiritual poverty of someone who could sacrifice a kingdom for personal gratification and then complain about the sacrifice for the rest of his life. Number 12. Prince Albert Victor, the heir shrouded in scandal. What happens when rumours themselves become a form of vulgarity? Prince Albert Victor, eldest son of the future Edward VII, lived from 1864 to 1892, his brief life surrounded by persistent allegations of scandalous conduct that historians still debate. Whether the specific accusations were true or false, the sheer volume and nature of rumours suggested that something about his behaviour troubled even the permissive Victorian aristocracy. The Cleveland Street scandal of 1889 linked Albert Victor's name to a male brothel, though no definitive evidence of his involvement ever emerged. The historical record shows that several aristocratic men were implicated in patronising the establishment, and Albert Victor's name circulated in gossip despite official efforts to suppress the connection. Whether he actually visited Cleveland Street or was merely victim of malicious rumour, his reputation suffered from the association with conduct considered both illegal and deeply shameful in Victorian Britain. His education and early development raised concerns among those responsible for preparing him for eventual kingship. Historical sources describe Albert Victor as languid, inattentive, and struggling with academic work, despite numerous tutors and careful instruction. His behaviour suggested someone more interested in pleasure than duty. His conduct at Cambridge apparently scandalous enough that the university was relieved when his time there ended. Rumours about his personal life persisted throughout his 20s. Allegations of affairs with both women and men circulated in society, none definitively proven but collectively painting a picture of someone whose private conduct didn't match his public position. The famous Jack the Ripper conspiracy theories that later linked him to the murders were almost certainly false. But the fact that people believed a royal prince capable of such horrors indicated how completely his reputation had been damaged by other conduct. His engagement to Princess Mary of Teck in 1891 appeared designed partly to settle him down and provide stability his life lacked. Historical accounts suggest the match was more about managing his reputation than genuine romantic attachment. Before the wedding could occur, Albert Victor contracted influenza during the pandemic of 1891 to 1892, dying in January 1892 at age 28. His death was met with public grief but private relief among those who'd worried about his fitness for kingship. His brother George, the future George V, inherited both his position as heir and his intended bride, Mary of Teck, eventually becoming a far more stable and respected monarch than Albert Victor seemed likely to have been. The vulgarity of Albert Victor's story lies partly in uncertainty itself. Whether his conduct actually justified the scandalous reputation, or whether he was victim of court gossip and political enemies, his name became associated with behaviours considered shocking even in an era that tolerated considerable royal impropriety. The rumours themselves, sexual scandal, potential involvement in criminal activity, general dissolution, created legacy of vulgarity that overshadowed whatever good qualities he might have possessed. Number 13. Queen Mary I. Righteous brutality. Can religious devotion transform cruelty into something even more vulgar? Mary I, who ruled England from 1553 to 1558, combined genuine piety with systematic persecution in ways that earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, and demonstrated how conviction without mercy becomes its own form of vulgarity. Born in 1516, Mary spent her life fighting for legitimacy and religious restoration, her methods revealing that righteousness can justify conduct that would otherwise be recognized as grotesque. Her childhood and young adulthood created someone who saw the world in absolute terms. Declared illegitimate after her father, Henry VIII's divorce from her mother Catherine of Aragon, forced to serve her infant half-sister Elizabeth as lady-in-waiting, Mary experienced years of humiliation that convinced her compromise was weakness. When she finally gained the throne at age 37, she pursued religious restoration with intensity that mixed genuine faith with desire for revenge against those who'd marginalised her. The burnings began in February 1555 and continued until her death 3 years later. Historical records document approximately 300 executions for heresy during her brief reign. The victims burned alive in public spectacles designed to demonstrate the fate awaiting those who rejected Catholic doctrine. What made this vulgar, rather than merely brutal, was Mary's insistence that she was showing mercy, that burning bodies saved souls, that physical suffering was kindness compared to eternal damnation. Contemporary accounts describe her personal involvement in persecution. She reviewed cases, approved executions, and refused pleas for mercy, with language suggesting she viewed herself as doing God's work. When prominent Protestants like Thomas Cranmer were burned, Mary ensured the executions became public events, teaching moments that displayed what happened to heretics. The vulgarity lay in making suffering into religious theatre, presenting cruelty as righteousness. Her treatment of her half-sister Elizabeth showed similar pattern of religious fervour, justifying personal vindictiveness. Mary imprisoned Elizabeth in the Tower of London, questioned her about Protestant conspiracies, and seriously considered executing her. Only political calculation prevented it. Killing Elizabeth would have caused immediate crisis and potentially civil war. But Mary's desire to eliminate her Protestant rival was clear, her religious conviction providing justification for what was actually sibling rivalry and political fear. The phantom pregnancies that dominated her final years added element of tragic delusion to her reign. Mary desperately wanted an heir to prevent Protestant Elizabeth from inheriting, and twice announced pregnancies that proved false. Historical sources describe her swollen belly, her conviction that she felt the child moving, the elaborate preparations for births that never occurred. The court had to pretend to believe her even as months passed beyond any reasonable pregnancy term, the Queen's delusion making everyone complicit in obvious fiction. Her marriage to Philip of Spain brought foreign involvement that most English subjects resented. Mary pursued the match despite opposition because Philip was Catholic and might provide the heir she needed. That she had to offer him England's resources and support for his wars showed how completely her religious mission overrode national interest. She died in 1558 at age 42. Her reign remembered primarily for the burnings that earned her historical infamy. Number 14. James I, Favourites and Court Spectacles. How does a king's affection become court vulgarity? James I, who ruled England from 1603 to 1625, after already ruling Scotland as James VI, combined intellectual pretensions with personal conduct that made his court infamous for inappropriate intimacy and humiliating public displays. Born in 1566, James demonstrated throughout his reign that learning and wisdom didn't prevent him from elevating favoritism into something approaching scandal. His relationship with Robert Carr, whom he elevated to Earl of Somerset, showed the pattern that would characterize his reign. Carr arrived at court as an attractive young man with little qualification beyond catching the king's eye. Yet James promoted him rapidly to positions of power and influence. The physical affection James displayed toward Carr shocked courtiers accustomed to royal dignity. Public embraces, terms of endearment used in formal settings, and general conduct that suggested their relationship exceeded normal bounds of king and subject. The vulgarity intensified with George Villiers, later Duke of Buckingham, who became James's favourite in 1614. Historical sources document James's letters to Villiers using language that was startlingly intimate and possessive. He called Villiers his sweet child and wife, signed letters as Villiers's dear dad and husband, and generally wrote in terms that contemporaries found deeply inappropriate, regardless of whether the relationship was physical or merely emotionally excessive. The public nature of James's favoritism made it vulgar beyond whatever private conduct may have occurred. He insisted courtiers treat his favourites with respect, due to positions they hadn't earned through merit or service. Buckingham's rapid elevation through the peerage, from gentleman to duke in less than a decade, demonstrated that royal favour could overcome every conventional requirement for advancement. This corrupted the entire system of honours, making titles meaningless when anyone who pleased the king personally could achieve them. Court ceremonies became opportunities for humiliating displays of affection. James would embrace his favourites publicly, touch them constantly, and generally behave in ways that made observers uncomfortable. His insistence on sleeping in the same rooms as his favourites, justified through various explanations about security or convenience, fooled no one. Whether the relationships were sexual or James merely craved intimacy he couldn't properly express, the conduct violated every expectation of royal dignity. His treatment of his wife Anne of Denmark added to the vulgarity. Anne was largely excluded from influence and forced to witness James's public affection for his male favourites. Historical accounts suggest she resented this treatment, but had little recourse beyond withdrawing into her own apartments and maintaining separate court. The humiliation of a queen forced to compete for her husband's attention with court favourites became another spectacle everyone had to pretend not to notice. The political consequences of James's favouritism demonstrated how personal vulgarity damaged governance. Buckingham's influence over policy decisions was resented by councillors who'd served for decades, his judgment questioned by those who'd earned their positions through experience rather than physical attraction. When James died in 1625 at age 58, he left his son Charles, with Buckingham as inherited favourite, and a court culture that had normalised inappropriate intimacy and elevated personal affection above competent governance. Number 15. Henry I, Prolific Indulgence. Can sheer volume transform private conduct into public vulgarity? Henry I, who ruled England from 1100 to 1135, earned recognition for effective governance, but also for fathering more acknowledged illegitimate children than any other English monarch. Born around 1068, Henry demonstrated that political competence didn't require personal restraint, his sexual appetite producing a documented legacy that made his private life impossible to ignore. Historical records identify at least 24 illegitimate children Henry acknowledged and supported, though the actual number was likely higher. These weren't merely youthful indiscretions, but sustained pattern continuing throughout his adult life, the children coming from multiple relationships spanning decades. What made this vulgar, rather than merely immoral, was Henry's openness about it. He didn't hide his illegitimate offspring, but provided for them publicly, arranged marriages for them, and generally treated them as legitimate part of his extended family. His mistresses came from various social ranks, suggesting Henry's appetites were democratic, if nothing else. Noble women, ladies of the court, even women of lower status bore his children and received his support. The relationships themselves might have remained private, but the resulting children made Henry's conduct public knowledge. Each acknowledged child represented another instance of the king placing personal gratification above the dignity expected of his position. The political use Henry made of his illegitimate children added another dimension to the vulgarity. He married them strategically to nobles whose loyalty he wanted to secure, using his offspring as diplomatic currency. This transformed his sexual excess into state policy, his inability to restrain his appetites, producing human resources he could deploy for political advantage. Several of his illegitimate sons received earldoms and significant estates, positions that legitimate children of lesser nobles might have aspired to but couldn't achieve because the king's bastards occupied them. His legitimate family situation made the illegitimate children even more problematic. Henry's wife Matilda bore him two legitimate children, William and Matilda. When William died in the White Ship disaster of 1120, leaving only his daughter Matilda as legitimate heir, Henry's numerous illegitimate sons became obvious alternative candidates for succession despite their status. That Henry couldn't choose any of them without causing constitutional crisis showed how his personal conduct had created political complications beyond mere scandal. The irony of Henry's situation was that his illegitimate son, Robert of Gloucester, became one of his most capable supporters, while his legitimate daughter Matilda's succession attempt plunged England into civil war. His vulgar productivity had created loyal supporters from his illegitimate line, even as it complicated the legitimate succession he should have secured. Henry died in 1135 at age 67 from, reportedly, eating too many lampreys despite his physician's warnings, a final act of self-indulgence that killed him. His death initiated the anarchy, the civil war between Matilda and Stephen that devastated England for nearly 20 years. While the war had many causes, Henry's failure to secure clear succession stemmed partly from how his personal conduct had created too many potential claimants and too few with unquestionable legitimacy. Number 16. George II. Insults and marital theatre. Can public humiliation of a spouse become normalised vulgarity? George II, who ruled from 1727 to 1760, combined capable governance with personal conduct toward his wife that made their marriage a spectacle of mutual insult and public degradation. Born in 1683, George demonstrated that political competence and personal decency were entirely separate qualities, his treatment of Queen Caroline revealing vulgarity that existed despite rather than because of passionate emotion. His open affair with Henrietta Howard, which began before his accession and continued into his reign, wasn't merely having a mistress, but conducting the relationship with such public acknowledgement that Caroline's humiliation became court entertainment. Howard held official position as woman of the bedchamber to Caroline, meaning the Queen had to employ her husband's mistress and interact with her daily. This arrangement was deliberately degrading, forcing Caroline to maintain dignity while everyone knew her husband preferred another woman's company. George's verbal treatment of Caroline was equally vulgar. Historical accounts record him speaking to her with casual cruelty, insulting her intelligence despite relying heavily on her political judgment, mocking her appearance even as she bore him 8 children. He would publicly complain about her, compare her unfavourably to his mistresses, and generally treat her as if his position allowed him to abuse her verbally without consequence. that Caroline often advised him on political matters he then presented as his own decisions made the personal cruelty even more grotesque. What made this vulgarity particularly striking was that George actually depended on Caroline far more than he acknowledged. She provided political counsel that shaped his most important decisions, managed relationships with ministers when George's temper made him difficult, and generally ensured governmental stability through her intelligence and diplomacy. Yet George continued treating her with public contempt, unable or unwilling to recognise how completely his conduct undermined the dignity of both their positions. His behaviour after Caroline's death in 1737 revealed unexpected depth beneath the vulgar surface. Historical sources describe George's genuine grief, his acknowledgement that she'd been far more important to him than his conduct had ever suggested. He reportedly said she'd been the best wife, best friend, and best woman who ever lived. Sentiments he'd never expressed during her lifetime when they might have mattered. This deathbed recognition made his years of public cruelty even more inexcusable, suggesting he'd known her worth all along but couldn't bring himself to show it. His subsequent relationship with Lady Yarmouth showed he'd learned nothing from Caroline's death. He conducted this affair with the same public openness, again making his personal life subject of court gossip and public knowledge. The vulgarity of treating relationships as public entertainment continued unchanged, suggesting this wasn't passion he couldn't control, but deliberate choice about how to conduct himself. George died in 1760 at age 76, his reign remembered for military victories and stable governance, but also for personal conduct that showed how completely someone could separate public competence from private vulgarity. His treatment of Caroline became a historical example of how power enables mistreatment that would be condemned in others, but somehow becomes accepted when performed by kings. Number 17. Prince Frederick, extravagance and estrangement. How does a prince's rebellion against parental authority become vulgar theatre? Prince Frederick, eldest son of George II, lived from 1707 to 1751. His relatively short life dominated by public conflict with his parents that descended into displays of vulgarity on both sides. Born as heir to future king, Frederick spent his adult years demonstrating that family dysfunction amplifies into something grotesque when performed by royalty. The estrangement began with Frederick's treatment by his parents, who seemed to actively dislike their eldest son. When George became king in 1727, he delayed bringing Frederick from Hanover to England, apparently content to leave his heir abroad and away from court. When Frederick finally arrived, his parents treated him with open contempt, his mother, Queen Caroline, reportedly saying she wished he'd never been born. This wasn't merely private family conflict, but public knowledge that turned the royal family into spectacle. Frederick's response was to embrace opposition to his parents' policies and to live extravagantly in ways calculated to annoy them. He established his own court at Lancaster House that became gathering place for political opposition, effectively creating rival power centre to his father's court. This wasn't merely political disagreement but personal rebellion, using political alliance to strike at his parents emotionally. His sexual conduct and relationships added to the vulgarity. Frederick maintained mistresses and conducted affairs, his behaviour not particularly worse than other royals, but conducted with apparent desire to create scandal that would embarrass his parents. His treatment of his eventual wife Augusta of Saxe-Gotha mixed genuine affection with using her and their children as weapons in his conflict with his parents. When Augusta was about to give birth to their first child, Frederick insisted on removing her from Hampton Court, where his parents were in residence, and transporting her to St. James's Palace specifically to prevent them from being present at the birth. The financial disputes between Frederick and his father descended into public vulgarity. Frederick constantly demanded larger allowances and more income, not primarily because he needed money, but because the conflicts provided opportunities to embarrass his father. Parliamentary debates about the Prince of Wales' income became forums for airing family grievances. The personal conflict between father and son played out as constitutional questions about proper support for the heir. Historical accounts describe Frederick as personally charming, but fundamentally shallow, more interested in pleasure and opposition than in preparing for eventual kingship. His court culture emphasized entertainment and extravagance. Musicians and artists received his patronage while serious political education apparently held little interest. His approach to being heir seemed focused on enjoying the position's privileges while avoiding its responsibilities. His sudden death in 1751 at age 44 from complications of an abscess cut short what would likely have been further years of public family conflict. The vulgar irony was that his parents' hatred meant they showed little grief at his death, his mother reportedly saying "thank God" upon hearing the news. His son succeeded his grandfather as George III, bypassing the troubled relationship that had made Frederick's generation of the royal family into public spectacle of mutual contempt. Number 18. Henry VII. Cold calculation as cruelty. Can financial obsession become a form of vulgarity? Henry VII, who ruled England from 1485 to 1509 after winning the throne at Bosworth Field, combined effective governance with personal conduct so cold and calculating that contemporaries found it deeply disturbing. Born in 1457, Henry demonstrated that establishing a dynasty didn't require warmth or generosity, his treatment of subjects and family alike revealing vulgarity in emotional absence rather than passionate excess. His financial practices bordered on extortion. Henry used bonds and recognizances to control the nobility, forcing them to acknowledge debts to the crown for real or imagined offences, then holding these obligations over them as tools of control. This legal mechanism allowed him to bankrupt anyone who displeased him simply by demanding payment of accumulated penalties. The system created an atmosphere of fear where no one was secure, everyone potentially subject to financial destruction if they lost royal favour. Historical sources document specific cases that showed the vulgarity of this system. When the Earl of Northumberland was murdered by his own tenants in 1489, Henry used this as opportunity to levy enormous fines on the Earl's son, taking advantage of tragedy to extract money. When Lord Mountjoy was found guilty of a minor offence, Henry imposed such crushing penalties that Mountjoy's family faced ruin. These weren't necessary enforcement of laws, but deliberate cruelty disguised as justice. His treatment of his mother, Margaret Beaufort, showed the emotional coldness that made his conduct vulgar beyond mere financial harshness. Margaret had fought for years to see her son gain the throne, yet Henry kept her at distance once he achieved power. He controlled her finances, limited her independence, and generally treated her more as potential threat than devoted mother. That he could maintain this cold formality with someone who'd sacrificed so much for him revealed character that lacked normal human warmth. His response to his wife Elizabeth of York's death in 1503 demonstrated similar emotional absence. Elizabeth had been beloved by the people and had given Henry 7 children, providing the heirs necessary to secure his dynasty. When she died at age 37, Henry's grief appeared more focused on losing her reproductive capacity than mourning a partner. Historical accounts suggest his main concern was whether he should remarry to produce more heirs, his widow's status making remarriage politically complicated. The vulgarity of his conduct showed most clearly in his final years. As he aged and his health deteriorated, Henry's financial obsession intensified. He personally reviewed accounts, questioned expenses, and accumulated wealth that served no purpose beyond possession itself. His treasury at death contained enormous sums, money he'd extracted through his harsh systems but never deployed for national benefit. He hoarded gold while his subjects suffered under taxation and penalties that fed his accumulation. His death in 1509 at age 52 meant the throne passed to his son, Henry VIII, whose extravagant spending reversed his father's accumulation within years. The vulgar irony was complete. Henry VII's cold calculation and cruel financial practices built a fortune his son dissipated, pursuing the warmth and passion the father had lacked. Between them, they demonstrated that vulgarity existed at both extremes, in excess and in the complete absence of normal human feeling. Number 19. Queen Anne's Court. Favoritism as governance. Can a monarch's emotional dependence transform court into vulgar spectacle? Queen Anne's reign, from 1702 to 1714, saw court culture dominated by her intense relationships with female favourites, whose influence over her created public drama that mixed politics with personal intimacy in ways that shocked observers. Born in 1665, Anne demonstrated how emotional neediness could make governance itself seem vulgar when personal relationships determined policy. Her relationship with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, dominated the first half of her reign. Sarah had been Anne's close friend since childhood, but once Anne became queen, Sarah's influence extended far beyond normal bounds of friendship. She controlled access to Anne, influenced appointments, shaped policy through her personality, rather than through official position. Historical accounts describe Sarah's behaviour as bullying. She would berate Anne, insult her, treat her with contempt while simultaneously demanding loyalty and favour. What made this vulgar was the complete role reversal it created. Anne was queen, theoretically the most powerful person in Britain, yet she allowed Sarah to dominate her emotionally and politically. Their correspondence shows Anne pleading for Sarah's affection, apologising for imagined offences, generally behaving like dependent child rather than sovereign. This emotional subordination became public knowledge. The Queen's weakness for her favourite-making governance seemed like personal drama rather than statecraft. The political factionalism this enabled was deeply damaging. Sarah was strongly Whig in her politics, and she used her influence over Anne to promote Whig policies and politicians. This meant party affiliation became less about political philosophy and more about relationship to the Queen's favourite. Capable Tories were excluded while mediocre Whigs received advancement. The entire system corrupted by Sarah's personal dominance over Anne's emotional life. The breakdown of their relationship created even more vulgar spectacle. As Anne gradually transferred her affections to Abigail Masham, Sarah's attacks intensified. Historical sources document Sarah threatening to publish Anne's private letters unless she received continued favour, attempting to blackmail the Queen into maintaining their relationship. That a subject could threaten a monarch this way and not face immediate punishment showed how completely the normal power dynamics had been corrupted. Anne's relationship with Abigail Masham repeated the pattern with different political valence. Abigail had Tory sympathies, and as she replaced Sarah in Anne's affections, court politics shifted accordingly. Again, policy followed personal intimacy rather than governmental logic. The vulgarity lay in reducing national governance to the level of a queen's emotional needs, political change happening because of bedroom conversations rather than parliamentary debate. The public nature of these court dramas made them impossible to ignore. Pamphlets and newspapers documented the power struggles. Everyone understood that influencing Anne meant gaining favour with whichever woman currently held her emotional attention. This made the monarchy seem ridiculous, reducing it to level of personal relationships that belonged in private homes rather than palace of state. Anne's death in 1714 ended this particular form of court vulgarity, but it had damaged the monarchy's dignity. She died at age 49, her reign remembered partly for successful union with Scotland, and partly for the grotesque spectacle of a queen whose emotional dependence on favourites made her court into theatre of personal drama, masquerading as governance. Number 20. Edward III, the decline of a warrior king. How does ageing transform a respected monarch into figure of vulgar dependence? Edward III ruled England from 1327 to 1377, one of the longest reigns in English history. His early decades brought military glory and capable governance, but his final years descended into conduct that shocked those who'd revered him. Born in 1312, Edward demonstrated that even the most successful rulers could end their reigns in vulgarity if they lived too long. His early reign established him as model of chivalric kingship. His victories in France, particularly at Crecy and Poitiers, made him legendary. He founded the Order of the Garter, established English as dominant military power in Europe, and governed effectively with Parliament. His court was culturally sophisticated, his governance generally competent. This made his later decline all the more striking. The contrast between what he'd been and what he became highlighted the vulgarity of his final years. The change began after his wife Philippa of Hainault died in 1369. They'd been married for 40 years, and her death seemed to remove the stabilising influence that had moderated Edward's conduct. Within a year, Edward had taken up with Alice Perrers, a woman of uncertain background who gained complete domination over the ageing king. Historical sources describe Alice as grasping and manipulative, using her influence to accumulate wealth and power with no concern for propriety. What made Edward's relationship with Alice vulgar was how publicly he allowed her to exercise power. She attended court functions wearing jewels that had belonged to Queen Philippa, a deliberate insult to the late Queen's memory. She influenced judicial decisions, taking bribes to secure favourable outcomes in cases before royal courts. She accumulated estates and wealth through the king's favour, enriching herself while Edward's governance deteriorated. Parliament complained repeatedly about Alice's influence, but Edward was too besotted to act. Historical accounts describe him as senile and manipulated, his once sharp political judgment completely compromised by his infatuation with a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. That he allowed her to dominate him so completely showed how age and desire had reduced him from warrior king to pathetic figure incapable of maintaining dignity. The political consequences were severe. With Edward mentally declining and Alice controlling access, governance suffered. His son, John of Gaunt, attempted to manage affairs, but the situation created power vacuum that damaged royal authority. The vulgarity of the king's dependence on his mistress became inseparable from the kingdom's governance problems, personal conduct and political failure reinforcing each other. When Edward finally died in 1377 at age 64, Alice reportedly stripped the rings from his fingers as he lay dying, fleeing before his death was announced. This final act of theft from the dying king she dominated captured the vulgarity of their entire relationship. She'd used him for personal gain and abandoned him the moment he could provide no more benefit. Parliament posthumously condemned Alice and seized her properties, attempting to undo the damage her influence had caused. But Edward's reputation suffered permanently from his final years. The glorious warrior king remembered also as the senile old man who'd allowed a scheming mistress to dominate him and corrupt his governance. Number 21. Richard II. Tantrums as statecraft. Can a king's inability to control his emotions become governing crisis? Richard II, who ruled England from 1377 until his deposition in 1399, combined sophisticated cultural patronage with emotional volatility that manifested in public tantrums unbecoming of his position. Born in 1367, Richard demonstrated throughout his reign that artistic sensitivity and political judgment were separate qualities, his conduct revealing someone temperamentally unsuited for the power he wielded. His response to opposition consistently descended into childish displays that shocked contemporaries expecting royal dignity. When Parliament questioned his policies or his favourites, Richard would rage publicly, threatening vengeance against those who dared constrain him. These weren't calculated displays of authority, but genuine loss of emotional control that made him appear weak even when asserting royal power. The vulgarity of his favoritism toward Robert de Vere reached levels that troubled even a court accustomed to royal preferences. Richard elevated de Vere rapidly through the peerage, creating him Duke of Ireland despite his having no Irish connections and minimal qualification for such honour. More troubling were the whispers about the nature of their relationship. Richard's behaviour toward de Vere suggesting intimacy that went beyond normal friendship between king and subject. When the Lords Appellant challenged Richard's authority in 1387 to 1388, his response mixed fear with vindictiveness that became vulgar in its extremity. Initially forced to submit, he spent the next decade plotting revenge against those who'd humiliated him. When he finally struck in 1397 to 1398, his actions weren't justice but personal vendetta. He arrested former opponents on trumped-up charges, executed or exiled them, and confiscated their properties with vindictive glee that made his conduct seem petty rather than kingly. His treatment of his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, showed rare genuine affection, but his response to her death in 1394 descended into theatrical grief that crossed into vulgarity. He ordered her favourite residence at Sheen destroyed, apparently unable to bear seeing it without her. This gesture might have seemed romantic, except for its destructive wastefulness, eliminating valuable royal property because he couldn't manage his emotions maturely. His second marriage to Isabella of Valois created its own scandal. Isabella was only 6 years old when Richard married her in 1396, he being 29. While the marriage wouldn't be consummated until she matured, the age gap troubled contemporaries. That Richard's motive was primarily political, seeking French alliance, didn't make the situation less disturbing. A grown man wedding a child for diplomatic convenience. His final years showed increasing paranoia and arbitrary cruelty. He required nobles to sign blank charters that he could fill in with whatever obligations suited him later, creating instruments of financial coercion that destroyed any possibility of trust. He demanded loans he never intended to repay, confiscated properties on flimsy pretexts, and generally governed through fear and unpredictability. When Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile in 1399, Richard's support collapsed immediately. His deposition revealed that years of vulgar conduct, the tantrums, the favoritism, the vindictiveness, the emotional instability, had destroyed any reservoir of loyalty. He died in captivity in 1400 at age 33, probably murdered. Having demonstrated that vulgarity in a king breeds contempt, that eventually destroys the authority emotional self-control might have preserved. Number 22, George V, private cruelty behind public dignity. Can impeccable public conduct mask private vulgarity? George V, who ruled from 1910 to 1936, maintained reputation for duty and propriety that made him beloved by his subjects. Yet behind the carefully maintained public image, historical sources reveal a man whose private conduct toward family members showed casual cruelty that would be considered vulgar in any context. Born in 1865, George demonstrated that dignified public performance could coexist with private behaviour that betrayed lack of basic kindness. His treatment of his children, particularly his eldest son David, the future Edward VIII, combined rigid discipline with emotional coldness that damaged relationships permanently. Historical accounts describe George's parenting as harsh and unforgiving. His children raised an atmosphere of fear rather than affection. He would berate them publicly for minor infractions, compare them unfavourably to each other, and generally make clear that his approval was commodity they couldn't earn no matter how they tried. His language in private was shockingly crude for someone who insisted on perfect propriety in public. Courtiers and family members recorded George using vulgar expressions, making crude jokes, and generally speaking in ways that contradicted his public image of dignity. This wasn't merely informal speech among friends, but harsh language directed at those who couldn't respond in kind, servants, subordinates, family members who had to endure his verbal abuse. His treatment of his wife Mary was publicly respectful, but privately often curt and dismissive. Historical sources suggest he took her devotion for granted, showing little appreciation for her efforts while expecting constant support. When she displeased him, he would withdraw into cold silence that could last days, using emotional manipulation to punish her for failures real or imagined. What made George's private vulgarity particularly notable was its contrast with his public persona. He understood perfectly how to behave appropriately in official contexts. His public speeches, his conduct at state functions, his relationships with politicians and foreign leaders all displayed proper dignity. That he could maintain this performance publicly while treating family members cruelly privately suggested the dignity was learned behaviour rather than reflection of genuine character. His response to his son David's relationship with Wallis Simpson showed this complexity. George's opposition was politically justified. Simpson's unsuitability as potential queen was obvious, but his manner of expressing it descended into cruelty. He told David he'd ruined his life, predicted disaster, and generally made clear his contempt for his son's judgment. While his concerns proved accurate, his harsh delivery damaged their relationship beyond repair. His famous dying words, "Bugger Bognor," when told he would recover and visit Bognor Regis again, captured the gap between public and private George. Officially, he was dutiful king who loved his people. Privately, he was man who found his official duties burdensome and his subjects occasionally irritating. The vulgarity lay not in the crude language, but in the lifetime of performing dignity he apparently didn't genuinely feel. He died in 1936, at age 70, his public reputation intact, but his private legacy more complicated. His children's memoirs and letters revealed the cost of his private cruelty, showing how even apparently successful monarchs could damage those closest to them through conduct they'd never display publicly. Number 23. Queen Caroline of Brunswick, Scandal as Identity. Can a queen's response to mistreatment become its own form of vulgarity? Caroline of Brunswick, wife of George IV, lived from 1768 to 1821. Her life defined by the spectacular public breakdown of her marriage and her own increasingly outrageous conduct. Born a German princess, Caroline's tragedy was being married to George when he was Prince of Wales, a match that produced immediate mutual hatred and decades of scandal that reduced both their dignities. George's treatment of Caroline was undeniably cruel. He was reportedly drunk at their wedding, spent their wedding night passed out, and made no secret of his contempt for her thereafter. This would make Caroline purely sympathetic victim, except that her response to this treatment descended into conduct that contemporary observers found equally vulgar. Rather than maintaining dignity despite her husband's abuse, she seemed determined to match his conduct with her own scandalous behaviour. Her personal hygiene became subject of court gossip. Multiple sources describe Caroline as careless about bathing and wearing clothing that was stained or soiled. While some historians suggest these accounts were propaganda from George's supporters, the sheer volume and consistency of complaints suggests at least some truth. Whether this was depression, defiance, or genuine lack of concern for appearance, the result was that the Princess of Wales became known for conduct that violated basic standards of propriety. Her relationships with male courtiers and servants created ongoing scandal. Caroline showed favoritism towards certain men that went beyond normal patronage, her behaviour suggesting intimacy inappropriate for a married woman of her rank. The delicate investigation of 1806 examined allegations that she'd had an illegitimate child, ultimately clearing her of that specific charge, but noting conduct that must be pronounced to be such as to have given occasion to very unfavourable interpretations. Her years abroad after separating from George saw her behaviour become increasingly outrageous. She travelled through Europe with an Italian servant named Bartolomeo Pergami, their relationship so obvious that even sympathetic observers found it impossible to defend. She dressed in costumes that exposed her ageing body inappropriately, danced in ways considered undignified for her age and rank, and generally behaved as if she'd decided that since she couldn't maintain reputation for propriety, she might as well abandon all pretense. Her return to England in 1820 to claim her position as queen created the greatest scandal. George had inherited the throne and wanted Caroline excluded from the coronation. The resulting public trial examined her conduct in excruciating detail, Caroline forcing Parliament to judge whether her behaviour made her unfit to be queen. The proceedings became public entertainment. Every vulgar detail of both their conducts examined and reported in newspapers. The most pathetic aspect was that Caroline gained public sympathy not because her conduct was defensible, but because George's was worse. She became cause célèbre for those who opposed the new king, her actual behaviour mattering less than her utility as weapon against him. She died in 1821 at age 53, shortly after being forcibly excluded from George's coronation, having spent her final years demonstrating that responding to cruelty with one's own vulgar conduct provided neither dignity nor victory. Number 24, Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, Victorian scandal in uniform. How does a prince reconcile military career with scandalous private life? Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, lived from 1819 to 1904, spending much of his 85 years as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, while conducting personal life that violated every Victorian standard of propriety his position supposedly represented. Born as grandson of George III, he demonstrated that long life and military position couldn't prevent vulgar conduct from defining one's legacy. His marriage created the foundation for decades of scandal. In 1840, he married Sarah Fairbrother, an actress, in defiance of the Royal Marriages Act. The marriage was legally void, meaning Sarah could never be recognised as his wife or as Duchess of Cambridge. Yet George lived with her for decades, fathering 3 children who couldn't legally inherit his titles or position. This wasn't romantic defiance of unfair law, but stubborn insistence on having what he wanted regardless of consequences. What made this vulgar, rather than merely regrettable, was George's hypocrisy about it. He insisted on receiving full respect due to his royal rank, while refusing to follow the rules that came with that rank. He demanded that society accept his irregular household, while knowing they legally couldn't. Sarah existed in social limbo, recognised privately but officially invisible, the mother of his children, but not his legal wife. His military career suffered from similar gap between position and performance. As Commander-in-Chief for 39 years, George opposed every reform that might have modernised the British Army. His conservatism wasn't principled but personal. He'd achieved his position through birth rather than merit, and he resisted changes that might have required actual military expertise rather than royal connection. The vulgarity lay in holding position of enormous responsibility while lacking qualification for it and refusing to step aside for more capable leadership. His spending and financial practices created ongoing scandal. George lived beyond his means continuously, accumulating debts that required periodic intervention to settle. His expensive tastes combined with his irregular household meant he needed more money than his official income provided. Yet he refused to economize or adjust his lifestyle to his actual resources. His relationship with society became increasingly awkward as he aged. Victorian propriety intensified during his lifetime, making his irregular marriage and his resistance to military reform seem more vulgar rather than less. Young officers resented serving under Commander-in-Chief, who'd achieved his position through birth and refused to implement reforms they knew were necessary. Sarah remained social embarrassment, her presence at military functions creating protocol difficulties no one quite knew how to resolve. His final years saw him increasingly isolated, holding military position long past usefulness because he couldn't bear to surrender the authority it provided. He finally resigned in 1895 at age 76, having held the position for 4 decades during which his personal vulgarity and professional inadequacy had damaged the army he supposedly led. He died in 1904 at age 85, having outlived most critics, but not outlived his reputation. His obituaries acknowledged his long service while carefully noting his resistance to reform and his irregular personal life. the vulgarity of his conduct too well documented to ignore despite his royal status. Number 25. Henry VIII's early court favourites, enabling royal excess. Can subjects' conduct become vulgar through enabling a king's appetites? Henry VIII's early court was dominated by young men who encouraged and facilitated his indulgences, their own behaviour becoming increasingly outrageous as they competed for royal favour. Rather than moderating Henry's excesses, these favourites demonstrated that proximity to vulgar power often corrupts those who seek it. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, exemplified this pattern. Brandon's own romantic life was scandalous. He secretly married Henry's sister Mary Tudor shortly after her first husband's death, risking execution for marrying royalty without permission. That Henry forgave him showed both their friendship and how completely Brandon understood that enabling Henry's desires protected his own position. He participated enthusiastically in Henry's revels, his affairs, and his excesses, making himself useful by never suggesting restraint. William Compton served as Henry's groom of the stool, responsible for the king's most intimate bodily functions, but used this access to facilitate Henry's affairs. Historical sources describe Compton arranging assignations, carrying messages, and generally operating as royal pimp. His own conduct wasn't notably better. He maintained mistresses and lived extravagantly, his behaviour tolerated because he made himself indispensable to Henry's private pleasures. Thomas Boleyn, father of Anne and Mary Boleyn, showed how enabling vulgarity could advance family interests. When Henry became interested in Mary Boleyn, Thomas didn't protect his daughter but encouraged the relationship, understanding that royal favour mattered more than his daughter's reputation. Later, when Henry's attention turned to Anne, Thomas supported that relationship as well. His willingness to prostitute his daughters to royal appetite, demonstrating complete moral bankruptcy disguised as courtly service. The jousting and revels culture these favourites cultivated enabled increasingly risky behaviour. As Henry aged and his athleticism declined, his companions continued encouraging dangerous activities that flattered his vanity while risking his safety. The famous tournament accident of 1524 that nearly killed Henry happened partly because no one in his circle would suggest that a 33-year-old king with increasing weight should perhaps limit his participation in dangerous sports. What made these favourites' conduct particularly vulgar was how completely they'd subordinated any independent judgment to pleasing Henry. They'd become enablers in the modern sense, people whose relationships with someone powerful involve facilitating and participating in destructive behaviours because confronting them might cost favour and position. Their own excesses were symptoms of this deeper corruption. The fate of some of these favourites showed that enabling vulgarity provided no permanent protection. Thomas Boleyn watched both his daughters become queens and then saw Anne executed when Henry's favour shifted. The men who'd encouraged Henry's appetites learned that royal friendship lasted only as long as they remained useful. Their vulgar conduct in service to Henry's desires purchased temporary advantage, but couldn't protect them once they ceased to provide what he wanted. Number 26. William IV. Open cohabitation. Can honesty about irregular relationships reduce their vulgarity? William IV, who ruled from 1830 to 1837, lived openly with actress Dorothea Jordan for 20 years before becoming king, fathering 10 illegitimate children with her. Born in 1765 as third son of George III, William initially had little expectation of ruling, which perhaps explains why he conducted his private life with such disregard for royal propriety. Yet when circumstance made him king, his past couldn't be erased. His relationship with Jordan began in 1790 when he was Duke of Clarence and she was successful actress. Rather than conducting the affair discreetly as royal protocol would suggest, William lived with her openly, establishing a household that functioned as marriage in all but legal recognition. This openness was unusual for royalty. Most kept mistresses but didn't create quasi-family units with them. The children complicated everything. William acknowledged all 10 of his illegitimate offspring, giving them the surname Fitzclarence and ensuring they received education and positions appropriate to their royal paternity despite their irregular birth. This created family that existed in legal limbo. Everyone knew they were the king's children, but they couldn't inherit titles or positions reserved for legitimate issue. The vulgarity lay not in having illegitimate children, but in creating large family whose existence was impossible to ignore or politely overlook. His abandonment of Jordan in 1811 showed the limits of his affection. When his debts became overwhelming and he needed to marry a legitimate wife who might produce legitimate heir, he simply ended the relationship. Jordan received financial settlement, but lost both the man she'd lived with for 2 decades and her social position such as it was. She died in poverty in 1816, her years with William providing neither lasting security nor social respectability. His subsequent marriage to Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen in 1818 legitimised his position, but couldn't erase his past. Adelaide was gracious toward his Fitzclarence children, but their existence remained an embarrassing reminder of his irregular history. When he unexpectedly became king in 1830 at age 64 after his older brothers died without legitimate heirs, his colourful past became subject of public discussion. What made William's situation notable was that his vulgarity was relatively mild by royal standards, but more visible because of his openness. He hadn't been exceptionally cruel or abusive. He'd simply lived with a woman he couldn't marry and created family he couldn't legitimise. The honesty with which he'd conducted the relationship made it harder to ignore than if he'd been more discreet. His reign was brief and marked by growing constitutional crisis over parliamentary reform, but his personal life remained subject of gossip. The ageing king with 10 illegitimate children and a patient German wife became figure of some sympathy. He'd followed his heart in ways royalty wasn't supposed to, and the consequences followed him even onto the throne. He died in 1837 at age 71, his irregular personal history unable to prevent his succession, but never quite forgotten during his reign. Number 27, Princess Margaret, Rebellion as Performance. Can refusing to conform become its own vulgarity? Princess Margaret, younger sister of Elizabeth II, lived from 1930 to 2002, spending her entire life pushing against the constraints of her royal position in ways that scandalised more traditional observers. Born into family that valued duty and restraint above personal desire, Margaret demonstrated that rebelling against such values could itself become form of vulgar display when done without purpose, beyond shocking others. Her early affair with Peter Townsend created the foundation for her later reputation. Townsend was divorced, which made marriage to him impossible for a royal princess in the 1950s. Margaret's handling of the situation combined genuine feeling with theatrical display of suffering that made the entire episode public drama. When she ultimately chose not to pursue the marriage, her announcement framed it as sacrifice for duty, but the years of public speculation had already transformed private heartbreak into scandalous entertainment. Her marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960 appeared to solve her romantic problems, but instead created new opportunities for vulgar conduct. Both Margaret and Tony conducted affairs during their marriage, each knowing about the other's infidelities, yet continuing the marriage for years. Their fights became legendary among their social circle, their mutual cruelty and public arguments making their relationship into spectacle that violated every standard of royal dignity. Her drinking and smoking were excessive even by the permissive standards of her social set. Margaret would often appear at official functions clearly intoxicated, her behaviour inappropriate, and her speech careless. She smoked continuously, despite health warnings, her defiant continuation, even after lung surgery, demonstrating self-destructive streak that went beyond normal vice into something resembling deliberate harm. Her treatment of servants and staff revealed unpleasant personality behind the rebellious princess image. Multiple accounts describe Margaret as demanding, rude, and cruel to those who couldn't respond in kind. She would summon staff at all hours, make unreasonable demands, and treat people with casual contempt that reflected poorly on her character, regardless of her royal status. What made Margaret's vulgarity particularly sad was its purposelessness. Unlike Edward VIII, who at least had specific goal of marrying Wallis Simpson, Margaret's rebellion seemed directed at nothing beyond expressing her dissatisfaction. She pushed against royal constraints but never articulated what she wanted instead. Her conduct shocked and dismayed, but achieved nothing except damaging her own reputation and health. Her final years, after her divorce in 1978 and into the 1990s, saw her increasingly isolated. Her heavy smoking led to lung problems and eventual stroke that left her partially paralysed. She died in 2002 at age 71, having demonstrated that rebelling against royal duty without purpose created life defined by vulgarity rather than freedom. The poignancy of Margaret's story lay in wasted potential. She was intelligent, witty, and could be charming when she chose. But she spent her life performing rebellion rather than finding a constructive way to use her position and talents. Her vulgarity was symptom of deeper purposelessness, shocking behaviour filling void where meaningful life might have been. Number 28, Duke of Windsor post-abdication, entitled Exile. How does former king's bitterness become ongoing vulgarity? The Duke of Windsor, formerly Edward VIII, spent 35 years after his abdication demonstrating that giving up throne didn't mean accepting reduced circumstances gracefully. From 1936 until his death in 1972, he conducted himself with such persistent sense of grievance and entitlement that his post-abdication life became extended display of vulgar self-pity. His immediate concern after abdication was money. Despite receiving substantial settlement, the Duke complained continuously about finances, suggesting he'd made enormous sacrifice that should be compensated indefinitely. His demands for increased allowances, his calculations of what he believed he was owed, his general focus on material compensation for his abdication, all revealed someone who'd made a choice but refused to accept its consequences. His insistence on royal status for Wallis Simpson became obsessive to point of vulgarity. Though she would never be Her Royal Highness, the Duke demanded she be treated as if she were, creating awkward situations wherever they went. He would arrive at events and expect Wallis to receive curtsies and protocol due to royalty. She legally wasn't. His inability to accept this reality made every social situation potentially uncomfortable. His treatment of his family showed remarkable pettiness. He resented his brother George VI for not giving Wallis royal title. He complained about his niece Elizabeth II's failure to embrace Wallis fully into the royal family. He maintained grievances about perceived slights and insufficient respect that suggested someone unable to move past the abdication crisis. His political sympathies during World War II suggested shocking lack of judgment at best and potential disloyalty at worst. His visit to Nazi Germany, his comments suggesting sympathy for Hitler's regime, his apparent willingness to provide information to Germans, whether these reflected his actual beliefs or merely his resentment at his treatment, they represented vulgar putting of personal grievance above national loyalty. The couple's lifestyle in exile mixed luxury with purposelessness. They maintained expensive establishments, travelled constantly, and filled their days with parties and social events that suggested lives empty of meaning. The vulgarity wasn't in the luxury itself, but in the decades spent living this way while complaining about the kingship he'd voluntarily surrendered. His memoirs and interviews presented himself as romantic hero who'd sacrificed everything for love, ignoring that he'd abandoned constitutional duty. This narrative required constant maintenance, turning every conversation and interview into opportunity to relitigate the abdication crisis and explain why he'd been wronged. The endless self-justification became form of vulgarity itself, inability to accept his choice and move forward. He died in 1972 at age 77, having spent more than half his life as the Duke who'd been king. His funeral in Britain showed that some reconciliation had occurred, but his decades of exile had been marked by vulgar refusal to accept reduced circumstances gracefully or find purpose beyond grievance and self-pity. Number 29. Edward VI's Regents, corruption surrounding innocence. Can vulgarity be more shocking when it exploits a child? Edward VI ruled England from 1547 to 1553, but he never truly governed. He became king at age 9 and died at 15. His brief reign dominated by regents whose conduct descended into vulgar power struggles and personal enrichment. Born in 1537, Edward was intelligent and pious, which made the behaviour of those supposedly serving him all the more grotesque. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Edward's maternal uncle, became Lord Protector and immediately began accumulating power and wealth. He built Somerset House, using materials seized from demolished churches, treating church property as personal resource. His arrogance and autocratic behaviour alienated fellow councillors, his methods demonstrating that proximity to power through a child king corrupted absolutely. Somerset's downfall came through John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, whose conduct was even more vulgar. Northumberland engineered Somerset's arrest and execution, then assumed control of government himself. His manipulation of young Edward was particularly disgusting. He cultivated the boy's religious radicalism to justify increasingly extreme Protestant policies that enriched Northumberland and his supporters. Using a child's genuine faith to advance personal interests showed remarkable moral bankruptcy. The court culture during this period combined religious extremism with personal enrichment. Protestant reformers stripped churches of decorations and valuable items, officially to purify worship, but practically to redistribute wealth to themselves. The vulgarity lay in the hypocrisy. These men claimed to serve God and their young king while actually serving their own ambitions. Northumberland's scheme to alter the succession after Edward's health declined showed the extremity of his vulgar ambition. He convinced the dying Edward to name Lady Jane Grey, Northumberland's daughter-in-law, as successor, bypassing Edward's half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth. This required a 15-year-old dying boy to change his father's succession plans, exploiting Edward's religious concerns about Catholic Mary, while actually serving Northumberland's determination to maintain power after Edward's death. The sexual corruption at court, though less documented, appears in contemporary accounts. With no adult king to enforce propriety and regents focused on power struggles, court culture descended into indiscipline. Young Edward was protected from the worst, but the atmosphere around him became increasingly vulgar, as those who should have been providing stability instead competed for advantage. Edward's death in 1553 at age 15 ended this particular manifestation of vulgar governance, though the succession crisis Northumberland created led to further turmoil. The poignancy of Edward's reign lay in the gap between his own serious religiosity and intellectual promise and the grotesque behaviour of those exploiting his youth to advance their interests. His regent's conduct demonstrated that vulgarity reached new depths when it involved using a child's authority for adults' corrupt purposes. Number 30. Queen Victoria's court favourites, whispered influence. Can rumours of vulgarity be as damaging as proven conduct? Victoria's long reign from 1837 to 1901 was marked by her intense relationships with servants and advisors, whose influence sparked persistent speculation about impropriety. While concrete evidence of actual vulgar conduct was lacking, the very fact that such speculation existed around the Queen suggested that her emotional dependence created situations that invited scandalous interpretation. John Brown, her Scottish servant, generated the most persistent rumours. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, Victoria increasingly relied on Brown for emotional support. Historical sources describe him speaking to her with familiarity that shocked courtiers, calling her woman rather than Your Majesty. entering her rooms unannounced, and generally behaving with complete disregard for normal protocol. Whether their relationship was anything beyond faithful servant and dependent mistress, the appearance created scandals that damaged Victoria's reputation. The nickname Mrs. Brown circulated in newspapers and private conversations, suggesting belief that Victoria's relationship with her servant had crossed appropriate boundaries. While no evidence supports the rumour that they secretly married, the fact that people believed it possible showed how completely her conduct had violated expectations. A queen who allowed her servant such intimacy inevitably invited vulgar speculation. Abdul Karim, her Indian servant in her final years, created similar concerns. Victoria elevated him rapidly, gave him authority over other servants, and spent hours alone with him. The racial dimensions added another layer. Victoria's apparent infatuation with Karim troubled her family partly because he was Indian, their prejudices mixing with genuine concern about a servant's excessive influence over the aging queen. What made these relationships potentially vulgar wasn't proven physical impropriety, but the emotional dependency they revealed. Victoria, who publicly projected image of eternal mourning for Albert, privately formed intense attachments to servants that suggested loneliness and need for intimacy that went beyond appropriate royal servant relationships. The vulgarity lay in the need itself and in how publicly it manifested. Her family's response revealed their concerns. After her death in 1901, they moved quickly to destroy correspondence with Brown and Karim, suggesting they believed the letters contained material embarrassing to Victoria's memory. This destruction means historians can never know the full nature of these relationships, but the very act of destroying evidence suggests the family believed something improper had occurred, or at least appeared to have occurred. The tragedy of Victoria's court favourites was that her genuine grief and loneliness led her into situations that damaged her dignity. Whether she was emotionally vulnerable, queen finding comfort in servants' devotion, or something more inappropriate, the result was decades of speculation that mixed sympathy for her widowhood with shock at conduct that violated every expectation of royal propriety. Number 31. Charles II's sons inherited excess. Can illegitimacy itself become a form of vulgarity when combined with royal acknowledgement? Charles II's numerous illegitimate sons, elevated to dukedoms and given royal status despite their irregular births, created a class of nobles whose very existence was vulgar reminder of their father's sexual excess. These men, the Dukes of Monmouth, Richmond, Grafton and others, demonstrated that being born from royal indulgence shaped their own conduct in predictable ways. James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, exemplified the pattern. As Charles's eldest illegitimate son, he received extraordinary favour, ducal title, military commands, treatment as if he were legitimate heir, despite everyone knowing he wasn't. This created a person whose entire identity rested on irregular foundation. His later rebellion against James II ended in execution in 1685, showing how completely his illegitimate status had poisoned his ambitions. Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, inherited his father's appetite for sexual adventure. He conducted numerous affairs, maintained mistresses, and generally lived as if he'd learned that royal blood, even illegitimate royal blood, exempted one from normal moral standards. His conduct wasn't particularly worse than other aristocrats, but his royal lineage made it seem like inherited vulgarity, Charles II's excess reproducing itself in the next generation. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton, showed similar patterns. Elevated through his father's indulgence, he lived extravagantly and conducted himself with arrogance that his birth should have prevented but his titles enabled. These illegitimate dukes occupied strange social position, nobles by their father's gift, but bastards by birth. Their very existence reminder of royal sexual conduct. What made their situation vulgar beyond their control was that they served as walking advertisements for Charles's indiscretions. Each one represented specific affair, specific moment when Charles had prioritized pleasure over propriety. The fact that he'd acknowledged and elevated them rather than quietly supporting them meant every public appearance reminded observers of the king's sexual excess. The political implications added another dimension. These illegitimate royal dukes complicated succession questions and created faction of nobles whose power derived entirely from irregular births. When James II, Charles's legitimate brother, inherited the throne, the illegitimate sons' positions became even more awkward. They owed everything to their father's indulgence, but had no secure place in the new reign. The pattern continued into subsequent generations. The descendants of Charles's illegitimate sons maintained their noble titles, but never quite escaped the taint of irregular origins. Even centuries later, these ducal families trace their ancestry to royal bastards, their honours originating in moment of sexual indulgence that Charles formalised rather than hiding. The vulgarity of their existence wasn't their fault. They didn't choose their parents or their irregular births, but their father's decision to elevate them publicly rather than supporting them quietly transformed his personal conduct into permanent feature of aristocratic landscape. Each subsequent Duke of Richmond or Grafton, representing Charles II's determination to normalise vulgarity through royal recognition. Number 32, Hanoverian Princes, continental coarseness. Did the Hanoverian succession import vulgar conduct into British royalty? The various Hanoverian princes who came to Britain with George I and continued through subsequent reigns brought continental attitudes toward royal conduct that British subjects found shocking. These German princes demonstrated that different cultural standards for royalty could appear vulgar when transplanted to British court. The language barrier itself created vulgar situations. George I never learned English properly, creating court where the king couldn't communicate directly with most of his subjects. This led to influence for those who could translate, and intermediaries who might misrepresent either side. The vulgarity lay in having monarch who couldn't speak to his own people, relying on others to mediate his governance. Hanoverian mistresses followed patterns different from British expectations. While British kings had traditionally maintained some discretion about affairs, Hanoverian princes brought their mistresses to court openly, expected them to receive official recognition, and generally treated extramarital relationships as normal features of royal life, rather than shameful secrets. British observers found this openness vulgar, even when they tolerated the affairs themselves. The Hanoverian princes' military backgrounds influenced their conduct. Many had served in German armies before coming to Britain, and they brought military camp standards of behaviour that seemed coarse in civilian court. Their drinking, their crude humour, their approach to women, all reflected military culture that violated British expectations for royal conduct. Their treatment of money showed different priorities. Hanoverian princes seemed more mercenary than British royals had been, more willing to accept payments from foreign powers, more focused on accumulating wealth. This commercial approach to royalty struck British observers as vulgar, reducing monarchical dignity to financial transaction. The family dynamics brought from Hanover were particularly toxic. The Hanoverian tradition of fathers and sons hating each other manifested in each generation. George I and George II despised each other, as did George II and Frederick, Prince of Wales. This familial hostility became public spectacle, the royal family's dysfunction displayed for all to see. Sexual mores also differed. Hanoverian princes seemed less concerned with legitimate succession than British tradition demanded, more willing to acknowledge bastards, less interested in maintaining appearance of proper marital relations. This continental casualness about sexual propriety translated to British court as vulgarity, different standards imported along with the dynasty. The gradual Anglicisation of the Hanoverian line showed these cultural differences diminishing over generations. By George III, The family had become essentially British in their attitudes and conduct. But the early Hanoverian princes' behaviour left legacy of vulgarity that took decades to overcome, their continental coarseness seeming inappropriate for British monarchy, even when it was normal by German standards. Number 33. Early Norman princes. Conquest violence. Can legitimate violence become vulgar through excess? The early Norman princes who followed William the Conqueror demonstrated that even justified military action could descend into vulgarity through unnecessary brutality and personal cruelty. These men, sons and grandsons of the Conqueror, showed that conquest culture created habits of violence that extended beyond military necessity into personal conduct. Robert Curthose, William's eldest son, combined military incompetence with personal excess. His nickname referred to his short stature, but his reputation was built on dissolute behaviour and inability to govern effectively. When he pawned Normandy to his brother William Rufus to fund his participation in the First Crusade, he demonstrated casual approach to territorial responsibility that violated every feudal obligation. Henry I, despite his effective governance, showed casual cruelty that marked him as product of conquest culture. His treatment of prisoners involved physical mutilation. Blinding and castration were standard punishments he ordered without apparent concern. While such practices were common in his era, Henry's personal involvement and apparent lack of compunction suggested someone for whom violence had become normalized to vulgar degree. William Clito, son of Robert Curthose, spent his life trying to reclaim inheritances he believed were his right. His career of continuous warfare, switching alliances, and general violence in pursuit of claimed rights showed how completely Norman princes had absorbed the idea that violence was an appropriate tool for any dispute. The vulgarity lay in the casualness with which they deployed brutal methods. The treatment of English subjects by these Norman princes revealed conquest aristocracy that saw violence as legitimate governance tool. Harsh taxes, arbitrary punishments, confiscation of lands, these weren't merely political necessities, but reflected a worldview where might made right and conquered populations existed to be exploited. Sexual violence appears in contemporary chronicles. Norman lords, including princes, were accused of forcing themselves on English women, using their power to take what they wanted. While such accounts must be evaluated carefully for propaganda purposes, the persistence of these accusations suggests a pattern of behaviour that contemporaries found troubling, even in violent era. The hunting culture these princes brought from Normandy involved violence that extended beyond killing animals. When peasants were caught poaching in royal forests, punishments were brutal: mutilation or death for taking deer that might feed starving families. The vulgarity lay in the disproportion between offence and punishment, violent enforcement of privileges that seemed designed to remind English subjects of their subordination. As generations passed and Normans became English, this conquest vulgarity gradually moderated. But the early Norman princes established patterns of aristocratic violence and casual cruelty that influenced English royal culture for generations, their conduct showing how military conquest created habits of brutality that extended into peacetime governance. Number 34. Stuart-era courtiers, elevated by scandal, proximity to vice. Can courtiers' vulgarity exceed their royal patrons? The Stuart courts of James I and Charles I elevated men whose own scandalous conduct matched or exceeded the kings who favoured them. These courtiers demonstrated that royal tolerance for vulgarity enabled even worse behaviour in those seeking royal favour. Robert Carr's career exemplified the pattern. His relationship with James I provided him with power he used corruptly. When his friend Thomas Overbury opposed Carr's marriage to Frances Howard, Carr had Overbury imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he was slowly poisoned. The subsequent investigation revealed Carr's complicity in murder, showing how someone elevated through royal favour felt entitled to eliminate obstacles through any means available. Frances Howard herself represented courtier vulgarity matching royal tolerance. She obtained annulment from her first marriage by claiming non-consummation, undergoing virginity examinations that were almost certainly fraudulent. her affair with Carr while still married, her role in Overbury's murder, her general conduct showed someone who understood that royal favour protected her from consequences that would have destroyed anyone else. George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, corrupted everyone around him through his dominance of both James and Charles. His family members received positions through his influence, creating a network of relatives and clients whose qualification was connection to Buckingham rather than ability. The systematic corruption of appointments and honours degraded the entire system of royal patronage. Buckingham's own conduct was extravagant to point of vulgarity. His spending was legendary, his building projects magnificent and ruinously expensive, his collecting voracious. He lived as if he were royalty rather than subject, his arrogance matching his power. His assassination in 1628 was celebrated by many who'd resented his corrupt influence. The sexual culture at Stuart courts involved these courtiers as much as the kings. Buckingham's relationships with both James and Charles sparked speculation about their nature. Whether these were physical or merely emotionally intimate, the conduct violated expectations for how subjects should interact with monarchs. The courtiers who participated in and enabled this culture showed that royal vulgarity created permission for their own. Lesser courtiers copied the patterns set by favourites. If Buckingham could enrich himself through royal favour, why shouldn't others attempt the same? If Carr could murder obstacles, why should others restrain themselves? The vulgarity of a few elevated courtiers metastasized through the system, corrupting court culture generally. The English Civil War that eventually erupted grew partly from decades of resentment at this corrupt court culture. When Parliament executed Charles in 1649, they were punishing not just a king, but an entire system of vulgar favoritism and corrupt courtiers who degraded governance through their personal excess. Number 35. Medieval minor royals. Documented for indecorum, the forgotten vulgar. Did medieval chronicle record preserve evidence of royal vulgarity that history has largely forgotten? Various minor princes, illegitimate royals, and distant relations, documented in contemporary sources for scandalous behaviour, demonstrate that vulgarity wasn't reserved for monarchs, but permeated royal families generally. These forgotten figures, recorded briefly for their misconduct, then lost to historical memory, show how pervasive improper conduct was among medieval royalty. Contemporary chronicles mention princes who died in drinking contests, trying to outconsume rivals in displays of vulgar excess that killed them. Names largely lost to history, these men demonstrated that lethal self-indulgence wasn't limited to kings, but infected entire royal classes. Illegitimate sons of various monarchs appear briefly in records for violent conduct, sexual assault, or criminal behaviour. Protected by their royal blood from full legal consequences, they operated with impunity that enabled vulgar conduct unchecked by normal social controls. Historical documentation is fragmentary, but the pattern is clear. Royal status, even illegitimate and distant, provided license for behaviour that would have been punished in commoners. Female royals documented for sexual misconduct challenge assumptions about medieval propriety. While carefully recorded to preserve their infamy, these women, princesses who took lovers, queens accused of adultery, royal mistresses whose conduct shocked even permissive courts, demonstrated that vulgarity wasn't gendered but opportunistic, occurring wherever power and desire intersected without sufficient restraint. Minor nobles elevated to royal circles through marriage or favour appear in chronicles for introducing vulgar practices to court. Their lower origins meant they lacked royal training in maintaining dignity, and their elevation gave them access to resources they used for excess that more established royalty might have moderated. They serve as evidence that vulgarity could be imported into royal circles from below, as well as spreading from above. Younger sons of royal families, unlikely to inherit significant power, used their status for personal indulgence, documented in ecclesiastical records and legal documents. Too minor for historical memory, but vulgar enough for contemporary documentation. They inhabited margins of royal life where status provided privilege without responsibility. The fragmentary nature of medieval records means these minor royals exist as incomplete stories. A name, a scandal, a brief mention, then silence. Yet their collective presence in historical documentation demonstrates that royal vulgarity was a system-wide phenomenon, not limited to a few notorious monarchs, but permeating entire structure of medieval royal families. Number 36. Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex. Persistent, non-compliance, can quiet defiance become its own form of vulgarity? Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, lived from 1773 to 1843, spending his entire adult life in quiet but persistent violation of royal marriage laws. Born as sixth son of George III, he demonstrated that vulgarity didn't require spectacular scandal, but could consist of sustained refusal to comply with basic requirements of his position. His first marriage in 1793 to Lady Augusta Murray was legally void under the Royal Marriages Act. Yet Augustus insisted on treating it as legitimate. He lived with Augusta openly, fathered 2 children with her, and generally conducted himself as married man, despite everyone knowing the marriage had no legal standing. This quiet defiance was vulgar not through excess, but through stubborn insistence on having what royal law forbade. When the marriage was legally nullified, Augustus continued his relationship with Augusta until their separation in 1801. Rather than learning from this experience, he repeated the pattern. His second marriage in 1831 to Lady Cecilia Underwood was again in violation of proper procedure. While this marriage was eventually regularized, the fact that he'd conducted it improperly initially showed his continued disregard for requirements governing royal marriages. What made Augustus's conduct vulgar was its passive-aggressive quality. He didn't openly rebel or make dramatic statements about unjust laws. He simply proceeded as if the laws didn't apply to him, creating situations that embarrassed the royal family without providing clear grounds for direct confrontation. His quiet non-compliance was more difficult to address than open defiance would have been. His children from his first marriage existed in legal limbo, similar to Charles II's illegitimate offspring, but without the compensation of ducal titles. They were princes' children, but not royal. Offspring of marriage everyone knew about, but law didn't recognize. Augustus's insistence on maintaining relationships with them forced the royal family to acknowledge situation they preferred to ignore. His interests in religious reform and liberal politics added another dimension of mild vulgarity. Unlike most royals who avoided controversial positions, Augustus supported Catholic emancipation and other progressive causes that embarrassed more conservative family members. This wasn't scandalous conduct, but political indecorum that violated expectations for royal neutrality. He died in 1843 at age 70, his obituaries noting his liberal politics and his irregular marital history. His vulgarity was subtle, not drunkenness or sexual excess, but sustained quiet refusal to comply with rules governing his life. In a family that valued conformity to duty above personal desire, Augustus's gentle but persistent defiance represented its own form of improper conduct. Number 37. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, brutal temperament. Can vulgarity consist primarily of character rather than specific acts? Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, later King of Hanover, lived from 1771 to 1851. His long life marked by reputation for brutality and aggressive temperament that made him widely despised. Born as fifth son of George III, he demonstrated that royal vulgarity could manifest not in sexual excess or personal indulgence, but in fundamental meanness of spirit. His military service scarred him both physically and psychologically. A serious head wound at the Battle of Tournai in 1794 left him with facial disfigurement and possibly contributed to his aggressive personality. Contemporary accounts describe him as having a vicious temper, quick to take offense, and capable of extreme cruelty when crossed. The mysterious death of his valet Joseph Sellis in 1810 created scandal that never fully resolved. Sellis was found dead with his throat cut in circumstances that some suggested involved Cumberland's guilt rather than the official verdict of suicide. While inquiries cleared Cumberland, the whispers persisted that he'd murdered his valet in rage or to cover some other scandal. Whether true or not, the fact that people believed him capable of murder indicated his reputation for violence. His marriage to his niece Frederica of Mecklenburg-Strelitz in 1815 scandalized society. Though first-cousin marriages were legal, marrying one's niece violated social norms even in aristocratic circles where cousin marriages were common. The relationship suggested either disregard for propriety or troubling family dynamics, neither reflecting well on Cumberland's character. His political positions were reactionary to point of vulgarity. As fierce opponent of Catholic emancipation and any liberal reform, Cumberland represented die-hard conservatism that seemed extreme even in conservative royal family. His aggressive advocacy for harsh policies, his opposition to any social progress, his apparent enjoyment of using power to suppress dissent, all suggested someone whose politics reflected personal cruelty rather than principled conservatism. His treatment of subordinates was reportedly harsh and arbitrary. Military officers who served under him described his command style as brutal. Servants in his household lived in fear of his temper, and generally everyone who had to interact with him did so warily. The vulgarity lay in using his position to abuse those who couldn't defend themselves, his rank protecting him from consequences of behaviour that would have resulted in social ostracism for anyone else. When he became King of Hanover in 1837, after Victoria's succession to the British throne, Hanover's laws prevented female succession. His reputation for reactionary brutality preceded him. His reign in Hanover confirmed worst expectations. He revoked the liberal constitution, suppressed dissent harshly, and generally governed in ways that alienated his subjects. He died in 1851 at age 80, his long life having demonstrated that vulgarity could consist not of excess or indulgence, but of sustained meanness, cruelty elevated to governing principle, and temperament so aggressive that it made everyone around him miserable. Number 38. King Stephen, weak authority and disordered court. Can inadequacy itself become vulgar? King Stephen ruled England from 1135 to 1154 during a period known as the Anarchy, his reign characterized by civil war and breakdown of royal authority. Born around 1096, Stephen demonstrated that vulgarity didn't require active misconduct, but could consist of failing so completely at basic requirements of kingship that dignity became impossible to maintain. Contemporary chroniclers mocked Stephen's inability to maintain authority. They described him as too kind, too willing to forgive enemies, too easily manipulated by advisors. In an era when kings were expected to project strength and inspire fear, as well as loyalty, Stephen's weakness appeared almost indecent, a failure to perform kingship adequately that made the entire institution seem vulgar through his inadequacy. His court lacked the discipline expected of royal household. Without strong king to enforce standards, courtiers and officials operated with minimal oversight. Corruption flourished, appointments went to highest bidders rather than most qualified candidates. And generally, the machinery of governance descended into disorder that chroniclers found shameful. The vulgarity lay in the chaos itself, proper order replaced by barely controlled anarchy. His conflict with Empress Matilda, his cousin who had equal claim to throne, descended into warfare that devastated England for nearly 20 years. What made this vulgar rather than merely tragic was Stephen's inconsistency. He would capture Matilda, then release her, make agreements, then break them, show mercy that looked like weakness, then cruelty that seemed arbitrary. His conduct lacked coherent principle, making it appear not just ineffective, but somehow indecent in its randomness. The famous incident of his capture at Battle of Lincoln in 1141 exemplified his vulgar inadequacy. Taken prisoner by Matilda's forces, He endured imprisonment while his supporters scrambled to negotiate his release. A king captured in battle wasn't inherently shameful. It could be honourable misfortune. But Stephen's capture seemed to confirm his inadequacy, rather than demonstrating brave defeat, contemporary accounts treating it as further evidence of his weakness. His eventual victory over Matilda came not through military success or political skill, but through Matilda's own mistakes, and eventually through compromise. The Treaty of Wallingford in 1153 named Matilda's son Henry as Stephen's heir, effectively acknowledging Stephen's inability to establish his own dynasty, while allowing him to keep throne for his remaining life. His death in 1154, at age around 58, was met with relief rather than mourning. His reign had demonstrated that incompetence could be its own form of vulgarity, not through active misconduct, but through failing to maintain the dignity and authority his position required. The chronicler's mockery of Stephen established him as negative example, the king whose weakness made kingship itself seem vulgar. Number 39, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, 15th century, Lancastrian indulgence. Did the chaos of civil war enable royal vulgarity that peacetime would have constrained? Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, who lived during the 15th century Wars of the Roses, demonstrated that violent political circumstances could excuse or enable personal conduct that would have been condemned in more stable times. His life showed how aristocratic privilege, combined with political turmoil, created space for behaviour that embarrassed even his own party. The historical record on Henry is fragmentary but suggestive. Contemporary chronicles note his excessive drinking, his poor military discipline, and his general conduct that failed to match his high birth and position. In an era when discipline and martial prowess were essential royal qualities, Henry's apparent inability to control his appetites marked him as inadequate to his rank. His relationships and sexual conduct created minor scandals, documented in court records and church documentation. While not scandalous enough to dominate historical memory, the scattered references suggest someone whose private life didn't match the public dignity expected of a prince. The vulgarity lay in the gap between what he should have been and what he actually was, a prince in rank but deficient in behaviour. What made Henry's conduct notable was that it occurred during a period of such political chaos that personal scandals could be overlooked. With England torn by civil war between Lancaster and York, individual princes' moral failings seemed less important than their political loyalties. This created an environment where behaviour that might have ended careers in peacetime instead passed with minimal consequence. His military service showed similar patterns. He participated in campaigns, but apparently without distinction. Contemporary accounts suggest he was brave enough, but lacked the leadership and strategic thinking expected of someone of his rank. His military conduct, like his personal behaviour, was adequate but not impressive, marking him as someone who'd achieved his position through birth rather than merit. The pattern of Lancastrian princes during this era suggested that the dynasty's political weaknesses enabled personal ones. Without strong kings to enforce standards, minor royals like Henry could indulge in conduct that would have been restrained under more effective monarchy. The vulgarity was partly Henry's, but partly systemic, product of political dysfunction enabling personal dysfunction. His death during the Civil War passed without particular historical notice. The sketchy record suggests someone whose life mattered primarily for his political allegiance, rather than for any personal achievement or scandal significant enough to warrant detailed documentation. He represented type of minor royal, whose vulgarity was too mild to dominate historical record, but too persistent to be completely ignored. Number 40. Early Stuart minor princes, grouped entry, collective indulgence. Did minor royals' collective vulgarity create court culture that enabled greater scandals? The early Stuart period produced numerous lesser princes and distant royal relations, whose individual misconduct might have been forgiven, but whose collective behaviour created atmosphere of indulgence and excess. Rather than examining each separately, Their combined conduct illustrates how vulgarity permeated Stuart courts at every level. These minor princes, younger sons, illegitimate relations, distant cousins elevated by proximity to power, demonstrated that Stuart court culture encouraged excess regardless of one's position in succession. They gambled continuously, wagering amounts they couldn't afford on cards, dice, and any other game available. Their debts accumulated until family members or the crown itself intervened, teaching them that irresponsibility had no lasting consequences. Their drinking was excessive even by Stuart standards. Contemporary accounts describe parties where these minor royals competed to consume most alcohol, celebrations ending with participants unconscious or violently ill. The vulgarity lay not merely in drinking, but in the competitive excess, treating dangerous overconsumption as entertainment and mark of status. Sexual conduct among these minor princes followed patterns set by James I and his favourites. They seduced servants, maintained multiple mistresses, and generally treated women as available for aristocratic pleasure. Protected by their royal connections from full legal consequences, they operated with impunity that enabled behaviour that would have destroyed commoners' reputations. Their participation in court masques and entertainments showed similar excess. These elaborate performances featured sexual innuendo, costume changes that bordered on striptease, and generally violated standards of propriety that supposedly governed court life. Minor princes participated enthusiastically, using these events as opportunities for display and indulgence that normal court functions didn't permit. The violence that occasionally erupted among these minor royals added dangerous element to their vulgarity. Duels over trivial insults, brawls during drinking sessions, and general physical aggression demonstrated that their excess wasn't merely self-destructive, but potentially harmful to others. Their royal status made legal consequences unlikely, enabling patterns of violence that continued unchecked. What made their collective conduct particularly vulgar was how it normalized excess throughout court culture. When minor princes behaved this way continuously, it became difficult to maintain standards for anyone. Their conduct created a baseline of acceptable vulgarity that made restraint seem almost prudish, corrupting entire court culture through accumulated example. The English Civil War that eventually erupted grew partly from decades of disgust at court culture these minor princes exemplified. While they weren't individually responsible for the political crisis, their collective vulgarity contributed to broader sense that Stuart monarchy had become irredeemably corrupt. Their behaviour, summed across dozens of minor royals over decades, helped delegitimize the entire system they represented. As we close this journey through 4 centuries of shockingly vulgar conduct, we've witnessed how power without accountability creates space for behaviours that would be condemned in anyone else. From Henry VIII's transformation of personal desire into state policy, to the Duke of Windsor's decades of entitled grievance, these 40 royals demonstrated that being born to privilege guaranteed neither dignity nor decency. What emerges from these stories is understanding that vulgarity took many forms: sexual excess and financial corruption, emotional cruelty and political vindictiveness, spectacular scandal and quiet persistent defiance. Some royals like Charles II embraced their vulgarity openly, making shamelessness into art. Others, like George V, maintained public dignity while treating family members with private cruelty. Still others, like King Stephen, showed that inadequacy itself could become vulgar when someone utterly failed to meet their position's basic requirements. The tragic pattern was how rarely these royals faced meaningful consequences. Protected by their birth and position, they could behave in ways that would have destroyed ordinary people's lives and reputations. Parliament might complain, the public might gossip, chroniclers might condemn, but the vulgarity continued, enabled by systems that placed royal status above accountability. Yet their stories also remind us that historical memory judges more harshly than contemporaries could. Henry VIII might have died believing his conduct was righteous, but history remembers him as tyrant whose appetites consumed everyone around him. George IV's extravagance seemed magnificent to him, but appears pathetic to us. The Duke of Windsor's romantic sacrifice looks more like abandonment of duty with each passing decade. These 40 royals, in all their vulgar variety, show us something fundamental about power and human nature. Given authority without restraint, freed from consequences that govern normal lives, people often choose poorly. Their conduct wasn't merely improper, it was deliberately, persistently, sometimes gleefully vulgar in ways that remind us that crowns don't bestow virtue and thrones can't instill decency. Sleep well, and remember, behind every palace wall, beneath every crown, existed people whose power enabled their worst impulses as often as it called forth their best qualities.